The afternoon sun hammered through the garage door at an angle that turned motor oil into liquid amber and chrome into mirrors. Marcus McKenna wiped his hands on a rag already dark with grease, the kind of stain that never fully washed out, no matter how many times the fabric went through Elena's old washing machine. He'd stopped trying to clean them properly about 6 months after she died, when he realized she was the only person who had ever cared whether his work clothes looked presentable. The radio played Creedence Clearwater Revival, something about fortunate sons and military men, and Gunnar let the irony wash over him without comment. The carburetor from Mr. Chen's 1998 Harley Softail lay disassembled on the workbench in front of him, its brass jets and float bowl catching the light. Rebuilding carburetors was meditation for men who'd forgotten how to sit still away to keep hands busy while the mind worked through problems that had no mechanical solution. His left leg ached where the prosthetic met flesh the way it always did when Arizona monsoon season approached and the barometric pressure started its inevitable drop. 34 years since the IED had taken everything below his knee, and the phantom pains still arrived with the weather like clockwork. He'd learned to ignore them the same way he'd learned to ignore a lot of things that couldn't be changed. The shop door connecting to the house swung open. Sarah stepped through carrying her backpack, still in the private school uniform she wore to St. Margaret's Academy. Navy skirt, white blouse, the little crest on the pocket that cost him an extra $200 a year. Elena had insisted on private schools, said public education in their district wasn't giving Sarah the foundation she'd need for college. Gunnar had agreed because Elena was usually right about things like that, and because watching his daughter walk across the stage in a cap and gown mattered more than the overtime he'd worked to afford the tuition. Her face carried that particular expression he'd learned to read over 12 years of fatherhood, the one that said she had something difficult to say and was working up the courage to say it. The backpack hit the floor with the thud of textbooks that weighed more than they had any right to, and she crossed to the workbench where he stood. "Dad, you're still working. Graduation's at 6. Gunnar checked the wall clock, the one with the Harley-Davidson logo that had hung in this garage since before Sarah was born. 3:15. He had time. "I know, kiddo. Just finishing this carb rebuild for Mr. Chen. He needs his bike for the weekend run to Sedona." Her fingers traced the edge of the workbench, not quite looking at him. The tell was subtle but unmistakable. Whatever she needed to say had weight behind it. "You promised you'd be there early. Third row center, you said." He set down the brass jet he'd been inspecting, turned to face her fully. The conversation required his complete attention, the kind of focus he'd learned in the Marines when a squad leader needed to really hear what a private wasn't saying out loud. "Have I ever broken a promise to you?" The question hung between them for 3 seconds. Her eyes met his dark, like Elena's had been carrying that same mixture of intelligence and stubbornness that meant she'd inherited more than just her mother's looks. "No." "Then why are you worried?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Gunnar saw the real issue forming itself into words. Her hands twisted together, a nervous gesture she'd picked up sometime in the last year since the funeral, since the world had rearranged itself into something harder and less forgiving. Because of the jacket. There it was. The thing she'd been circling around for the past week ever since the graduation invitations had gone out and Emma Chen's mother had made that comment at the parent pickup line. Gunnar had heard about it secondhand, the way fathers of 12-year-old girls usually heard about social landmines. Mrs. Chen had asked Sarah if her father was coming to the ceremony, and when Sarah said yes, Mrs. Chen's smile had tightened in that particular way. People's faces changed when they were trying to hide their discomfort behind politeness. He walked to where his leather cut hung on its designated hook by the garage entrance, the one Elena had installed with the label that said work jacket, even though they both knew it represented something more complicated than a piece of clothing. The Iron Brotherhood patch took up most of the back, red and white against black leather, the skull, and crossed pistons that marked him as a member of the Phoenix chapter. Smaller patches dotted the front, his road name Gunnar in white letters, the American flag on the right shoulder, the Marine Corps Eagle Globe and anchor on the left. His hands touched the leather, felt the worn smoothness that came from a decade of desert sun and highway wind. The jacket was part of who he was, the same way his prosthetic leg was part of him, the same way his military service was written into his DNA, whether he wore the uniform anymore or not. "Why?" Sarah's voice came out smaller than she probably intended, younger than 12. "People stare. they whisper. Emma's mom asked if you were dangerous. The word landed with the weight Mrs. Chen had probably intended, the kind of judgment that came wrapped in concern for children's safety, but really meant something else entirely. Gunnar had heard variations of that question for years at school functions and parent-teacher conferences, and the one time he'd volunteered to chaperone a field trip before the teacher found a reason why they had enough adult supervision already. And what did you tell her? That you're my dad and you're a good person, but you still want me to hide who I am. The accusation wasn't harsh, just factual. Sarah's face crumpled, slightly tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, and Gunnar realized with the clarity that sometimes arrived too late that he'd pushed harder than he'd meant to. I just want one night where it's about me, not about people judging you. He crossed to the workbench, patted the stool next to him. Sarah climbed up, and for a moment she looked 8 years old again, small and uncertain in a world that kept expanding faster than she could grow to meet it. Gunnar reached into his jeans pocket, fingers finding the object he'd carried every day for the past 2 years, ever since Elena had pressed it into his palm in that lavender-scented hospice room, where time had moved differently than it did in the rest of the world. The challenge coin caught the afternoon light as he set it on the workbench between them. Worn brass about the size of a silver dollar, the Marine Corps emblem raised on one side, and the unit insignia for 2nd Battalion 7th Marines on the other. The edges had smoothed from years of being carried in pockets and turned between nervous fingers, from being gripped tight during moments when courage needed a physical anchor. He flipped it, caught it, set it back down with the eagle globe and anchor facing up. Your mom gave me this the day she got her diagnosis. Sarah's hand reached out, touched the coin with one finger. Her voice came quiet, remembering. I was 10. She showed it to me, said it was special. She'd been keeping it since I gave it to her in 1992, right after I got out of the hospital in Germany. Told me she'd hold on to it until I needed it again. The memory surfaced with the clarity traumatic moments always carried sharper than ordinary time, every detail preserved like specimens in amber. Elena sitting beside his hospital bed, her hands warm on his, where they lay on the white sheets, the space where his left leg should have been, creating a hollow under the blankets that his mind still couldn't fully process. She'd been 23 then, barely old enough to understand what it meant to love a man who'd come back from war, changed in ways that went deeper than missing limbs. Sarah picked up the coin, turned it over to read the inscription on the back that Gunnar had never mentioned before. Her lips moved silently as she traced the words with her eyes. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. To your country, to your corps, to your brothers, to your family, to yourself. She looked at him, really looked the way kids did when they were trying to understand something adults took for granted. What does that have to do with the jacket? Gunnar took the coin back, felt its familiar weight settle into his palm like coming home. Your mom said something to me that day. She said you wore that uniform with pride, even when people called you a baby killer. Wear your life with the same pride. Don't hide who you are because people don't understand. The words had more power now than they'd had when Elena first spoke them, the way wisdom sometimes needed time and distance to fully reveal itself. Sarah sat very still on the stool, her school uniform already rumpled from a day of classes, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. This jacket represents brothers who saved my life, just like this coin represents brothers who fought beside me. Your mom understood that. She never asked me to hide either one. The challenge hung unspoken between them. Sarah understood what he wasn't saying directly, that asking him to leave the jacket home was asking him to pretend he was someone else, something smaller and more acceptable and fundamentally dishonest. The tears that had threatened earlier spilled over, now silent trails down her cheeks that she wiped away with the back of her hand. I miss her. Me too, kiddo, every single day. They sat together in the garage while the afternoon light shifted and CCR gave way to Tom Petty on the classic rock station, and Gunnar thought about all the promises he'd made to Elena in those final weeks. Be there for Sarah, every milestone. Don't let grief make you distant. Don't hide. Stand tall. Keep your word. The promises had seemed simple in the hospice room, straightforward in the way military orders were straightforward before you encountered the complexity of real situations. Living them turned out to be harder than he'd anticipated, each day presenting new chances to choose the easy path instead of the right one. Sarah slid off the stool, picked up her backpack, At the door to the house, she turned back. "Will you tell me about the coin tonight, after graduation?" Gunnar nodded, and something in Sarah's posture straightened, like she'd found whatever answer she'd come looking for, even if it wasn't the one she'd expected. "Okay, I'm going to get ready." The door closed behind her, and Gunnar was alone again, with Mr. Chen's carburetor in the radio and the challenge coin that had traveled from Kuwait to Germany to Arizona to Elena's nightstand to his pocket. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of promises kept and promises still outstanding, and thought about a February morning in 1991 when he'd learned what it cost to make a choice between following orders and doing what was right. The memory came whether he wanted it or not, rising up from the place where he kept the war locked away, except when it decided to visit unannounced. The desert had been cold that morning. The kind of cold people who'd never been to Kuwait didn't believe when you told them about it. Sand and sun and a wind that cut through your uniform like the temperature couldn't decide whether it wanted to freeze you or cook you, so it did both at once. Sergeant Marcus McKenna, 25 years old, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, sat in the lead Humvee of a four-vehicle convoy pushing north toward positions the intelligence briefing said were clear, but experience suggested might not be. His squad, 8 Marines plus himself, had been running reconnaissance for 3 days without encountering anything more threatening than abandoned Iraqi positions and the occasional unexploded ordnance that made everyone nervous until the EOD team rendered it safe. Private David Morrison rode shotgun, literally his M16 pointed out the passenger window at nothing in particular and everything at once. The kid was 19, fresh-faced, even after 3 months in country, the kind of Marine who still believed the war would make sense if you just followed the rules hard enough. He'd been assigned to Gunner's squad right after the ground invasion started, replacing Corporal Hendricks, who'd taken shrapnel in the shoulder during the first day's push and gotten medevac to Germany. The radio crackled with static and voices reporting grid coordinates in all clears that didn't mean much when the situation on the ground changed faster than command could update their maps. Gunner scanned the landscape through the windshield, watching for the things that didn't belong. The disturbances in sand patterns that might indicate IEDs, the glint of sunlight on metal that could be weapons or could be nothing at all. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter, urgent, but controlled the way they'd been trained. "Sarge, we got civilians pinned down grid 4 to 7 about 200 meters northeast." Gunner grabbed the binoculars, followed Morrison's pointing finger. Through the magnification, he could make out figures huddled behind what looked like the remains of a concrete building, the distinctive shapes of women and children pressed low to the ground. Small arms fire kicked up sand near them, muzzle flashes visible from a position further east that was either Iraqi holdouts or looters or some combination of the two that meant danger, regardless of political affiliation. The tactical situation resolved itself in Gunner's mind with the speed that came from training and experience. The civilians were trapped between advancing coalition forces and retreating Iraqi soldiers who didn't care about collateral damage. Air support was scheduled to arrive in 15 minutes, which meant the building would become a target zone, and anyone still there would be categorized as acceptable losses in the after-action report. He reached for the radio to call it in, to do what doctrine said, and wait for orders from someone higher up the chain of command who'd weigh the risks and benefits from a safe distance and probably decide that 4 civilians didn't justify risking 9 Marines. His finger was on the transmit button when Morrison spoke again, quieter this time, like he was talking to himself more than to his sergeant. "That's a family, Sarge. I can see kids, little ones." Gunner looked again through the binoculars. Morrison was right. 3 children, the oldest, maybe 8, the youngest, small enough to still be carried. Parents trying to shield them with their own bodies, knowing it wouldn't matter when the air support arrived and turned the grid square into a kill zone. The decision crystallized with the kind of clarity that only arrived in moments where all the options were bad and you had to choose anyway. He joined the Marines because his father had served in Vietnam and his grandfather had hit the beaches at Guadalcanal because defending the country meant something in the McKenna family line. But he hadn't joined to let kids die when he had the ability to prevent. It hadn't taken the oath so he could follow orders that violated every reason he'd put on the uniform in the first place. His hand moved from the radio transmit button to the steering wheel. The Humvee's engine was already running ready. Morrison, Hayes, Rodriguez were moving in to extract those civilians. "Get your gear ready." Corporal Hayes leaned forward from the back seat, his voice carrying the appropriate amount of doubt. Sarge, orders say to hold position for air support. Orders say a lot of things. I'm making a new call. That family will be dead in 10 minutes if we wait. We move now. He keyed the radio to the convoy channel, kept his voice level and professional, even though his heart rate had already started climbing. Victor 2 through Victor 4, hold position. Victor 1 is proceeding to extract civilians under fire. Cover our 6. The response came immediately, the voice of Lieutenant Chen in Victor 2 carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what Gunner was doing and what it would mean. Victor 1 negative. Wait for air support as briefed. Victor 2, those are kids dying right now. I'm going. Static filled the channel for 5 seconds that felt like 5 years. Then Chen's voice came back resigned and maybe a little bit proud even though he couldn't say so officially. Victor 1 understood. We have your back. Be advised you're on your own if this goes sideways. Gunner dropped the radio handset, put both hands on the wheel. The Humvee lurched forward, leaving the safety of the convoy formation and heading toward the sound of gunfire that was getting closer with every meter they closed. In the passenger seat, Morrison, chambered around his face, said in the expression young Marines wore when they just realized their sergeant was either crazy or brave, and the distinction didn't matter because they were going anyway. The distance closed. 200 meters became 150, became 100. The muzzle flashes from the Iraqi position resolved into actual weapons, AK-47s, mostly fired by men who'd seen too much war and were either defending their country or just trying to survive long enough to get home. The Humvee's armor was designed to stop small arms fire, but the windows were vulnerable, and everyone in the vehicle knew it. Gunner keyed the radio again, this time on the squad frequency. Hayes, Rodriguez, Morrison, when we stop you 3, provide suppressing fire. I'll get the family. 30 seconds in and out, no heroes. The Humvee skidded to a stop in a spray of sand 20 meters from where the family huddled. The doors flew open before the vehicle fully stopped, moving, and Gunner was out and running his M16 up and scanning for threats, while his legs carried him forward on muscle memory and adrenaline. Behind him, the distinctive crack of M16s on 3-round burst laid down covering fire that forced the Iraqi shooters to take cover instead of aiming. The family saw him coming, saw the American flag patch on his shoulder, and their faces showed the complex calculation of people who didn't know if rescue was arriving or just a different kind of danger. The father, maybe 30, maybe 50. Desert sun made everyone look older than they were, grabbed the oldest child and prepared to run. The mother clutched the baby and the middle child, her eyes meeting Gunner's with a desperation that transcended language. Gunner reached them, switched to the basic Arabic he'd learned in pre-deployment training, the phrases that covered emergencies and directions and not much else. Yalla, come quickly. He grabbed the father's arm, pointed toward the Humvee, where Morrison had the rear door open and was waving them forward. The family understood, started moving the father, carrying the oldest child and half dragging the middle one, while the mother ran with the baby pressed to her chest. Gunner moved with them backward, now his rifle trained on the Iraqi position where the shooting had momentarily stopped. That should have been the warning. The sudden absence of gunfire meant either the Iraqis had retreated or they were preparing something worse, and Gunner's combat experience suggested the latter more strongly than the former. He was 10 meters from the Humvee, still covering the family's retreat when the world exploded sideways. The IED must have been buried in the sand sometime earlier, either by retreating Iraqi forces or by insurgents who knew coalition troops would use this route. The blast caught the Humvee on the right side, the passenger side, where Morrison sat, and lifted the entire 3-ton vehicle off its wheels like a child's toy. The sound arrived after the pressure wave, a concussive force that knocked Gunner flat and drove the air from his lungs and made his ears ring with a tone that would persist for weeks afterward. He hit the sand hard, felt something in his left leg snap, with the clean certainty of bones breaking, and then the pain arrived in waves that made coherent thought difficult. Through vision that had suddenly tunneled down to a narrow field, he watched the Humvee crash back to earth on its side, watched Morrison's door fly open, watched the kid drag himself out with his uniform on fire. Hayes and Rodriguez were already moving combat medic training, overriding their own injuries, pulling Morrison away from the vehicle and beating out the flames with their bare hands. The Iraqi shooters, sensing opportunity, opened fire again, and rounds kicked up sand in patterns that were getting closer to where Gunnar lay, trying to remember how his legs were supposed to work. His left leg wouldn't respond. He looked down, saw bone protruding through shredded fabric and flesh, saw blood spreading across sand in a dark stain that his mind labeled as bad, even while his training said to ignore it and keep fighting. The M16 was still in his hand somehow, and he brought it up and fired 3-round bursts at the Iraqi position, more from spite than tactical calculation, buying Hayes and Rodriguez the seconds they needed to drag Morrison behind cover. The father he'd just rescued appeared in his narrowing field of vision, the Kuwaiti man's face showing the kind of determination that transcended self-preservation. Hands grabbed Gunnar under the armpits, started dragging him backward toward the cover of the overturned Humvee, and through the ringing in his ears, Gunnar heard Morrison's voice screaming for a medic, and Hayes responding that he was working on it and just stay down. The extraction took forever and no time at all, the way combat compressed and expanded seconds into eternities. By the time they had Gunnar behind the Humvee's bulk, his vision had started to gray at the edges, and his hands couldn't quite grip the rifle anymore. Hayes knelt beside him, cutting away what was left of his left pant leg, and even through the shock, Gunnar could see the medic's face go pale. "Sarge, your leg." "I know. Stop the bleeding. That's an order." Hayes worked with the efficiency of someone who'd trained for this scenario and prayed he'd never have to use the training. Tourniquet above the knee, tight enough to make Gunnar's vision white out for a moment, pressure bandage over the worst of the damage, even though they both knew the leg was gone, whether the bone was still technically attached or not. Morrison appeared above him, his face blackened with soot, but eyes clear and focused, his hands checking Gunnar's chest and arms for additional wounds, with the systematic approach they drilled into every Marine. "Sarge, stay with me. Medevac's inbound 2 minutes out." Gunnar tried to nod, managed something that might have looked like agreement. The pain had moved beyond specific locations and become a general condition of existence, the kind of hurt that made you understand why shock was actually your body's mercy rather than its failure. Through it all, the challenge coin in his breast pocket pressed against his chest, a small weight he could still feel when most other sensations had started to blur together. The Kuwaiti family huddled nearby, the children crying but alive, and Gunnar's last clear thought before consciousness started slipping away was that he'd made the right choice, even if it cost him the leg. Orders had said to wait. Children would have died. He disobeyed, and they'd lived. And if that was what failure looked like in the official report, then he could live with being a failure in the eyes of people who'd never had to watch kids get killed, because following procedure was more important than preventing murder. The helicopter arrived with the whump, whump, whump of rotor blades that Marines learned to love because it meant extraction and medical care and not dying in the desert. Strong hands lifted Gunnar onto a stretcher, strapped him down, and the world became motion and noise, and Hayes's voice in his ear saying something about Germany and surgery, and "He'd be fine, Sarge. You'd be fine, just hang on." Consciousness fragmented after that. The helicopter gave way to a field hospital, gave way to something that might have been an airplane and might have been a fever dream. When Gunnar finally surfaced into something resembling coherent awareness, he was in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, with clean white sheets and the antiseptic smell of modern medicine, and the hollow space under the blankets where his left leg had been. Elena sat beside the bed, her hand warm on his. She'd flown out as soon as the Red Cross notification reached her, had been sitting in that chair for who knew how long, while he'd been wherever morphine took people who'd had their legs blown off in the service of their country. Her face showed the strain of days without sleep and the kind of fear she was trying to hide behind competence, but her hands stayed steady on his. The commanding officer arrived on day 3, or maybe it was day 4, time had stopped meaning much, when your primary occupation was watching the ceiling and trying to accept that the person you'd been 2 weeks ago no longer existed. Colonel Hendricks was 50-something career Marine, the kind of officer who'd come up through enlisted ranks and remembered what it was like to follow orders issued by people who'd never seen combat. He pulled a chair next to Gunnar's bed, sat down with the careful posture of someone whose back had been destroyed by decades of carrying heavy packs over hostile terrain. "Sergeant McKenna, how are you feeling?" The question had too many answers, most of them inappropriate for addressing a superior officer. Gunnar settled for the simplest true thing. "Like I got blown up, sir." Hendricks nodded, a slight smile creasing his weathered face. The doctors say the surgery went well. You'll be fitted for a prosthetic once the healing progresses. Yes, sir. The silence stretched. Outside the hospital window, German rain fell with the persistence of weather that didn't care about wars or casualties or the complicated business of men trying to find words for things that didn't have good words. Hendricks pulled something from his pocket, a challenge coin, that caught the fluorescent light and reflected it back in brass and silver. You disobeyed direct orders, Sergeant. Yes, sir, I did. You risked 6 Marines for 4 civilians. 7 Marines, sir. I counted myself. Hendricks turned the coin over in his fingers, studying it like the engraving held answers to questions nobody wanted to ask out loud. The Kuwaiti family you saved, father, is a government official. He's requesting to meet you, wants to thank the American who gave his leg so his children could live. Gunner's throat tightened. He hadn't thought much beyond the immediate decision, hadn't calculated the cost-benefit in terms of body parts traded for lives saved. The leg had been gone before he'd really understood it was leaving, and dwelling on what that meant for his future seemed less important than acknowledging it had already happened. That's not necessary, sir. He's insistent. Says he'll wait until you're well enough to receive visitors. The rain continued. Somewhere in the hospital, equipment beeped, and nurses moved through corridors, and other casualties from other operations lay in other beds, processing their own versions of what war cost. Elena's hand squeezed Gunner's, gently reminding him she was there. She was real. She was staying. Hendricks set the challenge coin on Gunner's chest, right over his heart, where the weight of it settled into something that felt like benediction and judgment in equal measure. This is from your unit, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Your squad requested it specifically. Gunner picked it up, read the inscription on the front, turned it over to see the words engraved on the back in letters small enough that you had to squint to read them. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. Did I fuck up? Hendricks stood, walked to the window, looked out at rain that was already starting to ease. When he turned back, his face carried the expression of someone who'd made similar choices in his own wars and lived with the consequences long enough to know there were no clean answers. You saved 4 lives. You risked 7 to do it. Your men followed you into danger because they trusted your judgment. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. The official report will note that you showed initiative in a fluid tactical situation and successfully extracted civilians from a combat zone. What I'm telling you now off the record is that you made a choice every leader has to make eventually between the orders you're given and the man you want to be when the shooting stops. The coin pressed into Gunner's palm. Hendricks moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Semper Fi isn't just a motto, Sergeant. You lived it today. The Corps is proud to have Marines like you. The door closed and Gunner was alone with Elena and the coin and the hollow space where his leg had been. Elena's voice came quiet, steady, carrying the kind of strength she'd always had even when he hadn't noticed it was there. I'm proud of you too. The memory released him, dropped him back into the present, where Mr. Chen's carburetor still needed reassembly, and the graduation ceremony was now less than 3 hours away. Gunner set the challenge coin on the workbench, picked up the brass jet he'd been cleaning before Sarah interrupted, and went back to work with hands that remembered how to rebuild small mechanical things, even when larger problems remained beyond repair. At 5 o'clock, he cleaned up, washed the worst of the grease off his hands, changed into the clothes he had set aside earlier. Dark jeans, work boots that had been polished until they almost looked dressy, a white button-down shirt he'd ironed himself because Elena wasn't there to do it anymore, and he'd learned that some standards were worth maintaining even when nobody cared but him. The Iron Brotherhood cut went over the shirt leather, settling onto his shoulders with the familiar weight of belonging. The challenge coin went into his front right pocket where his hand could find it without looking. Sarah appeared from her room dressed in navy blue, her hair pulled back in the way Elena used to do for special occasions. And for a moment, Gunner saw his dead wife so clearly in his daughter's face that the grief threatened to become something larger than he could contain while standing in their living room at 5:15 on a Thursday evening. Ready, kiddo. Ready, Dad. They took his truck, the F-150 he'd bought used 3 years ago, and kept running through maintenance that was half necessity and half meditation. The drive to Redwood Middle School took 20 minutes through Phoenix traffic that was already starting to build toward rush hour, past strip malls and housing developments, and the desert landscape that Arizona couldn't quite pave over no matter how hard the city tried. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, one hand playing with the hem of her dress, nervous energy that she couldn't quite contain. Gunnar kept his eyes wrote in his mind on the promise he'd made to Elena, the one that said showing up mattered more than being comfortable, that standing tall meant something even when people wanted you small. The school parking lot was already half full when they arrived, families unloading from minivans and sedans, fathers in polo shirts and mothers in sundresses, and younger siblings who clearly didn't want to be there. Gunnar found a spot near the back away from the clusters of vehicles and parked the F-150 with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned to give himself room to maneuver. His Harley-Davidson Heritage Softail sat in the truck bed, secured with tie-downs he'd double-checked before leaving home. He preferred to ride rather than drive when possible, but transporting Sarah in her graduation dress meant the truck made more sense. The bike would stay put until they got home, a promise for later when the ceremony was done and they could both breathe again. The walk from the truck to the school entrance revealed the landscape of judgment Gunnar had learned to navigate over the past decade. Parents looked, then looked away, then looked back when they thought he wasn't watching. The Iron Brotherhood patches drew attention, the way visible difference always drew attention, people's eyes catching on the skull and crossed pistons and making rapid calculations about threat assessment and appropriate social distance. A young man in his 30s stood near the entrance wearing jeans and a polo shirt that stretched across shoulders that suggested military training, even if the civilian clothes tried to hide it. He had the posture of someone who'd learned to stand at attention and never fully forgotten the muscle memory. And when his eyes met Gunnar's, they held the kind of recognition that came from shared experience rather than personal acquaintance. The young man's gaze dropped to Gunnar's left leg, where the prosthetic was visible through the gap between boot and jeans, then lifted to the Marine Corps Eagle Globe and anchor patch on Gunnar's left shoulder. Something shifted in his expression, the assessment moving from suspicious to curious to respectful in the space of 3 seconds. He approached with the confident stride of someone who'd decided this conversation was worth having, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. His right hand came up, fingers forming the unmistakable shape of a salute that was technically inappropriate in civilian clothes, but carried meaning anyway. Semper Fi, brother. Gunnar returned the gesture, felt the automatic response trigger pathways that went deeper than conscious thought. Ura, your kid graduating. Yeah, my son Marcus, 6th grade. Saw your patch, Desert Storm. February 91, Yupan, Afghanistan 2007 to 2009. Lost my arm near Kandahar. He shifted and Gunnar noticed the prosthetic where the young man's left hand should have been, the advanced model with articulated fingers that technology had developed since Gunnar's own injury. They'll probably stare at both of us. Let them. The young man smiled, the expression carrying the dark humor Marines developed when the alternative was breaking under the weight of things that shouldn't be funny, but somehow were anyway. He extended his prosthetic hand, and Gunnar shook it, feeling the firm grip that the mechanism delivered with precision, engineered to mimic human strength. Brian Torres, good to meet you. Marcus McKenna, people call me Gunnar. Road name? Earned it in the Corps, kept it after. You ride? Used to, had to sell my bike after medical discharge bills piled up. Miss it every day. They stood together for a moment, two men who'd given different pieces of themselves to the same general cause, and the connection formed without needing additional words to cement it. Torres glanced at the Iron Brotherhood patch, then met Gunnar's eyes again. I respect what you guys do. The charity runs the veteran support. My uncle's in the Nomads chapter up in Flagstaff. Good people. You ever need anything, Phoenix chapter meets Sundays at the clubhouse on Van Buren. We take care of brothers. Torres nodded, storing the information somewhere it could be retrieved when needed. A woman's voice called his name from near the entrance, and he waved acknowledgement before turning back to Gunnar. Looks like my wife's ready to go in. Good luck tonight. You too. Sarah had watched the exchange from a few feet away, her face showing the kind of confusion kids displayed when their expectations collided with reality. As they walked toward the gymnasium entrance together, she kept glancing at her father with questions she didn't quite know how to ask. Dad, that man, he saluted you. He's a Marine, same as I was. But he looked normal. I mean, he was wearing a polo shirt. Yeah, Marines come in all kinds of clothing these days. The uniform's just fabric. What matters is what you carry inside. They reached the gymnasium doors and Gunnar pulled one open, held it for Sarah to enter first. The noise hit immediately 300 people in a space designed for maybe 250, the acoustic tiles doing their best to absorb sound and failing in the face of that much collective human energy. The air smelled like floor wax and the nervous sweat of sixth graders who were about to transition into middle school, whether they felt ready or not. The seating chart was posted near the entrance, students alphabetically arranged on stage risers. Families encouraged to sit wherever they could find space. Gunnar scanned the gymnasium, calculating sightlines and crowd density the way his military training insisted was necessary, even though the threat level at a middle school graduation was presumably low. Third row center section was still mostly empty, people having grabbed the seats near the aisles, and the back where escape was easier if small children got restless. He navigated toward his target position, conscious of the way people noticed him, the conversations that paused mid-sentence when the Iron Brotherhood patches entered peripheral vision, the parents who found sudden reasons to need seats further away from where he was heading. The trail he left through the crowd was visible in the negative space, families rearranging themselves to maintain comfortable distance from the man in leather, who walked with the slight limp of someone whose left leg didn't flex quite right, no matter how good the prosthetic was. Sarah split off toward the stage area where students were gathering, and Gunnar found himself alone in the third row with empty seats on either side that had been occupied moments before. An elderly couple to his left had stood up and moved when they saw him coming, the man muttering something about getting a better view, even though the third row was objectively one of the best positions in the gymnasium. A mother with two small children on his right had gathered her family and relocated to the back, her face tight with the kind of concern that translated as better safe than sorry, without ever asking what the actual danger was. He sat hands resting on his knees and let the world continue around him while he found the still place inside that combat had taught him to access. His right hand drifted to his pocket, fingers finding the challenge coin through the fabric of his jeans, and the familiar weight of it centered him in the moment. This was why he'd come. Not to make people comfortable, not to blend in, but to be present for his daughter because he'd promised Elena he would be, and because a man's word was the only currency that mattered when everything else got stripped away. On stage, Sarah found her position in the riser's second row from the front fifth student from the left. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they found him, and the relief that crossed her face when she confirmed he was exactly where he'd said he'd be made every uncomfortable stare worth tolerating. He touched his chest briefly, the gesture they had developed as shorthand for, I'm here, I'm staying, I love you. And Sarah's answering smile carried enough light to make the fluorescent gymnasium feel warm. Principal Dr. Rebecca Hayes stood at the podium, testing the microphone with the professional competence of someone who'd presided over these ceremonies often enough to have the routine memorized. She was 50-something, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing the kind of business suit that signaled authority without intimidation. Her eyes swept the crowd, doing the same threat assessment Gunnar had done, cataloging faces and potential problems with the efficiency administrators developed after years of managing teenagers and their parents. The murmur of conversation filled the space, hundreds of people talking over and under and through each other in the particular cacophony of family gatherings where everyone was related to someone, but nobody knew quite what to say. Cell phones appeared in hands positioned for the crucial shot when their student crossed the stage, documentation that this moment had occurred and could be shared with relatives who hadn't made the trip and social media followers who probably didn't care but would hit the like button anyway. Gunnar sat still while the world moved around him. His breathing stayed even, his posture relaxed but ready, the muscle memory of years spent in situations where being present meant being alert. The challenge coin pressed into his palm through the pocket fabric, and he thought about Elena asking him to promise about the weight of those promises when keeping them cost more than he'd anticipated. Movement from his left peripheral vision. Footsteps approached with the deliberate cadence of someone on official business, and Gunnar recognized the sound before he saw the source. Security. The uniform was unmistakable, even in his peripheral vision. Dark blue shirt, black pants, radio clipped to the shoulder keys, and handcuffs on the belt that announced authority in the specific way school security differed from actual law enforcement. The man stopped beside Gunnar's seat, close enough that his presence demanded acknowledgement, but not quite close enough to be physically threatening. Mid-40s, carrying maybe 20 extra pounds around the middle that suggested desk work, had replaced whatever physical fitness he'd maintained in his youth, hands clasped in front of his belt, in a posture that was probably meant to project calm professionalism, but read more as practiced intimidation. His voice came low-pitched to not carry beyond their immediate vicinity, but loud enough that nearby families couldn't help but overhear. "Sir, I'm going to need you to relocate." Gunnar didn't respond. His eyes stayed forward, focused on the stage where Sarah stood, pretending not to watch this interaction, while clearly watching every second of it. His hands remained where they were, resting on his knees, the challenge coin now pressed fully into his palm, where he could feel every ridge of the engraving. His breathing didn't change. The muscles in his jaw didn't tighten. He simply existed in the space he'd chosen, as if the request hadn't been made at all. The security officer waited. 5 seconds. 10. The silence between them became its own kind of statement, the absent response communicating more than any verbal argument could have conveyed. Around them, the noise level in the gymnasium shifted as nearby families noticed the confrontation developing, conversations pausing mid-sentence so people could turn and watch whatever drama was about to unfold. The officer shifted his weight, uncomfortable with Gunnar's non-reaction, but committed to whatever script his job required him to follow. "Sir, this is a family event. Your attire is making some families uncomfortable. We'd appreciate your cooperation." Still nothing. Gunnar's chest rose and fell with steady breaths. His eyes tracked slightly to the left, registering the officer's presence in his peripheral vision, but not granting him the respect of full eye contact. The challenge coin turned slightly in his palm, a small movement no one else could see, grounding him in the promise he'd made and the reason he was sitting in this chair in this gymnasium, surrounded by people who looked at his jacket before they looked at his face. The officer's hand moved toward the radio on his shoulder fingers, hovering near the call button in a gesture that was part warning and part threat. The movement was subtle but deliberate, a reminder that authority had options, that non-compliance could be escalated through official channels that involved additional security or potentially actual police. A phone appeared in someone's hand nearby, already recording, and Gunnar was aware without looking that this moment was being documented for later review by people who weren't present and wouldn't understand the context, but would definitely have opinions about what it all meant. The digital age had turned every confrontation into potential evidence, and he accepted that his leather cut and his refusal to move would be interpreted through whatever lens the viewer brought to the footage. Another figure approached from the right, younger than the first officer, broader in the shoulders, walking with the kind of confidence that suggested he wasn't used to being told no and didn't expect to start hearing it now. His name tag read Morrison, and his face carried that particular expression Gunnar had seen before, not quite hostility, not quite fear, but something in between that suggested personal stakes beyond just doing his job. Morrison stopped on Gunnar's right side, creating a bracket with the first officer that was probably supposed to feel intimidating, but mostly just felt like two men who'd watched too many police procedurals and thought security work operated on the same principles. His voice came out harder than his colleagues' less polite request and more formal demand. "Sir, this is your final warning. Move to the back row or we'll escort you out." Gunnar's eyes finally moved, tracking from the stage to Morrison's face with the kind of slow deliberation that made clear this wasn't submission, but rather a choice to engage. He took in the details, the wedding ring that suggested family, the military haircut that hadn't quite grown out, despite probably being years past service, the tension in the shoulders that read as barely controlled anger, rather than professional detachment. When Gunnar spoke, his voice came out level and quiet, pitched to carry only as far as necessary. "I'm here for my daughter, Sarah McKenna, third row center section. I promised her mother I'd be here. You want to explain to my 12-year-old why I broke that promise?" Morrison's jaw tightened. Whatever response he had been preparing shifted in the face of Gunnar's calm directness, and for a moment uncertainty flickered across his face before the anger reasserted itself. "Your motorcycle club affiliation is protected under the First Amendment. Same amendment I lost this leg defending." Gunnar's left hand moved, tapped his prosthetic leg through the jeans with a sound that was definitely not flesh on fabric. The gesture was small but unmistakable, and Morrison's eyes tracked to the movement, processing what that meant, recalculating whatever assumptions he'd made about who Gunnar was and why he was here. The first officer leaned in, trying to de-escalate whatever his colleague had started. Sir, we understand you have personal reasons for being here, but the dress code. I'm wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. The jacket is leather, same as half the other fathers in this room. If you have a specific policy against veterans wearing their organizational patches, I'd like to see it in writing. The silence that followed stretched longer than comfortable, and Gunnar knew he'd hit the problem they couldn't quite articulate. There was no written policy against motorcycle clubs. There was just discomfort assumption, the cultural baggage that came with patches and leather, and the stereotype that men like him represented danger rather than just difference. A third figure approached, and this one carried actual authority. Female, early 50s, wearing the same security uniform, but with additional insignia that marked her as senior staff. Her posture was pure military, the kind of bearing that never fully left people who'd served, and when her eyes landed on Gunnar's Marine Corps patch, her expression shifted from professional concern to something more complicated. She stopped, scanned the situation with the rapid assessment of someone who'd made tactical decisions under pressure before, and then her gaze dropped to Gunnar's left shoulder patch. Her hand came up almost reflexively, touching her own shoulder, where something invisible still lived in memory, and Gunnar saw the moment of recognition cross her face. Marcus McKenna. Gunnar stood not because the situation required it, but because addressing a fellow service member from a seated position felt wrong. They were nearly the same height, and up close he could see the small scars on her hands that suggested she'd worked with her hands in dangerous places, the kind of marks mechanics and combat engineers accumulated over years of handling equipment that didn't care whether you were careful. Yes, ma'am. I'm Laura Reynolds. My brother was David Morrison, 2nd Battalion, Kuwait. The name hit like physical impact, transported Gunnar back 34 years to a desert where a 19-year-old private had dragged him away from a burning Humvee and stayed with him until the medevac arrived. Morrison, good kid, good Marine. Gunnar had lost track of him after the war ended, the way you lost track of most people when military service scattered everyone to different bases and different lives. His voice came out rougher than intended, emotion threatening to crack through the careful control he'd maintained. Morrison, your brother pulled me out when the IED hit. Saved my life. Reynolds' face showed the complex mix of pride and grief that came from being related to someone who'd done something heroic and then suffered for it in ways the official record didn't capture. She nodded, slowly processing what Gunnar had just confirmed. He wrote home about that, said you disobeyed orders to save civilians, that it cost you your leg. I made a call. Kids were dying. The leg was worth it. Morrison, the security officer, not the dead Marine, had gone very still, his face showing the confusion of someone whose worldview had just shifted without permission. Reynolds glanced at him, then back at Gunnar, and something unspoken passed between them that had to do with family secrets in military service and the complicated way trauma got inherited across generations. Gunnar's hand moved without conscious direction, reaching for his pocket, pulling out the challenge coin that had traveled from Kuwait to Germany to Arizona to Elena's nightstand to his palm. He held it up where Reynolds could see it, the brass catching the gymnasium's fluorescent lights. Your brother gave me this. Well, not directly. The unit presented it to me in the hospital. But Morrison was one of the Marines who requested it, said I'd earned it. Reynolds leaned closer, read the inscription, and her eyes reflected something that might have been tears if she'd allowed them to fall in public. When she spoke again, her voice carried weight that went beyond just the current situation. My brother killed himself in 2005. PTSD. The VA tried, his unit tried, but some wounds go too deep. The gymnasium noise continued around them. But in the small bubble where Gunnar and Reynolds and the two security officers stood, the world had compressed down to things that mattered more than dress codes and public comfort. Morrison, the security officer, looked between them, his face showing the beginning of understanding that there was context here. He hadn't possessed history that complicated whatever simple narrative he'd constructed about the man in the motorcycle cut. Reynolds straightened her professional mask, reasserting itself, even though the personal moment had revealed cracks in the foundation. She turned to her subordinates, and her voice carried the kind of authority that came from actual leadership rather than just positional power. Mr. McKenna stays. He's a decorated Marine veteran attending his daughter's graduation. If anyone has concerns about his presence, they can speak with me directly. Morrison started to protest, his hand moving in a gesture that suggested disagreement, but Reynolds cut him off with a look that allowed no argument. "Officer Morrison, stand down. That's an order." The two security officers exchanged glances, and Gunner could see the unspoken conversation happening between them, whether to push back, whether Reynolds had the authority to overrule them, whether this was a fight worth having when the senior staff member had made her position clear. The moment stretched, balanced on the edge of escalation or de-escalation, and Gunner remained standing with the challenge coin in his hand, watching men decide whether to choose principle or practicality. A sound cut through the gymnasium, noise low and growing, a rumble that started as barely perceptible vibration and built into the unmistakable signature of multiple motorcycle engines approaching in formation. Heads turned toward the windows, faces showing confusion and concern, and in some cases outright fear, as the sound grew louder, closer, undeniable. Gunner's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, read the text message from Chains that contained only 3 words: "Outside, heading in." The gymnasium doors at the back opened with a force that wasn't violent, but was impossible to ignore. 12 men entered in single file, and the patches on their backs were identical to the one Gunner wore. Iron Brotherhood, Phoenix Chapter. Full colors. Reynolds looked at Gunner, and her face showed the calculation of someone who just watched a simple situation become exponentially more complicated. Morrison, the security officer, had gone pale, his hand moving to his radio with the kind of urgency that suggested he was seriously considering calling for police backup. The 12 men walked with military precision, their boots striking the gymnasium floor, in a rhythm that wasn't synchronized but felt coordinated nonetheless. At the front, Raymond Chains Walker led with the calm confidence of someone who'd walked into tenser situations than a middle school graduation and lived to tell about it. His gray beard was braided, his eyes scanning the room with the tactical awareness that never quite left people who had seen combat. They spread out as they moved forward, not clustering, but distributing themselves through the seating area in a pattern that Gunner recognized from squad formations designed to cover maximum ground. Some sat behind him, others flanked him to the left and right, filling the empty seats that parents had quietly vacated when the man in leather first appeared. They sat without ceremony, without looking at each other or at the security officers who watched with mounting alarm, and their stillness was somehow more intimidating than any aggressive posturing could have been. Chains took the seat directly behind Gunner, leaned forward slightly so his voice would carry without him needing to raise it above a murmur. "Brother." Gunner's hand found the challenge coin, gripped it tight enough that the edges pressed into his palm, hard enough to hurt, and he understood with perfect clarity that the night he'd planned, simple, quiet, just a father attending his daughter's graduation, had transformed into something larger and more complicated and infinitely more meaningful than he'd anticipated. Chain's presence behind him carried weight beyond just physical proximity. Gunner felt the shift in the room's energy, the way 300 people suddenly remembered they had collective breath to hold. The other 11 members of the Iron Brotherhood settled into their positions with the unhurried economy of movement that came from decades of knowing exactly where your body needed to be and how to get it there without wasted effort. Doc Williams sat 2 rows back, his silver star from Vietnam visible on his cut, because he'd earned the right to wear it and didn't believe in false modesty. Preacher Jones took the end seat in Gunner's row, his 70 years evident in the careful way he lowered himself into the folding chair, but his spine still military straight. The women riders, Maria Chen, Lisa Rodriguez, Anna Kowalski, distributed themselves through the formation, their Gulf War and Iraq service patches, marking them as warriors in their own right, rather than just accessories to male rebellion. The younger members formed the outer perimeter. Mateo Reyes, at 42, was barely middle-aged by motorcycle club standards, his border patrol experience showing in the way he watched exits and calculated threat vectors. Big Mike Johnson's 6'5" frame made the folding chair look like dollhouse furniture, and the scars on his knuckles told stories about bars in Kandahar, where disputes got settled with more directness than diplomacy. Reynolds stood frozen between the security officers and this new configuration of the problem she'd thought she was solving. Her hand hovered near her radio, and Gunner could see the calculations running behind her eyes. Call the police and turn this into a spectacle that would make the evening news, or try to contain the situation through authority that might not hold against 12 people who decided they had every right to be exactly where they were. Morrison, the security officer, made the decision for her. His radio was already in his hand, the call button pressed, words tumbling out faster than tactical thinking should have allowed. Dispatch, we need police backup at Redwood Middle School Gymnasium. Multiple unauthorized persons, motorcycle club affiliation, refusing to leave. The radio crackled back with confirmation, and somewhere in Phoenix, 2 patrol cars began their response to a disturbance call that would get logged as potential gang activity at a school event. Gunner's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't speak, just sat with his hands on his knees and let Morrison make whatever mistakes he needed to make to learn whatever lesson was coming. Reynolds grabbed Morrison's arm, her grip tight enough that he winced. What did you just do? My job. We have gang members. You have veterans. Look at their patches. Officer Morrison. Look at them. Morrison's eyes tracked across the assembled riders, really seeing them for the first time instead of just registering the leather and the skull patches. The military service ribbons became visible: Vietnam combat patches, Desert Storm campaign medals, the distinctive blue field of the Medal of Honor on one chest that made even Morrison pause because everyone knew what that particular piece of fabric meant. Doc Williams stood slow and deliberate, his age evident in the way his knees protested the movement, but his bearings still parade ground perfect. He walked toward Reynolds and Morrison with the measured pace of someone who'd learned patience in rice paddies while being shot at by people he couldn't see. When he reached them, he pulled out his wallet, extracted a card, held it where Morrison could read it. VA card, Vietnam 1968 to 1970, 1st Cavalry Division. I watched brothers die so you could have the freedom to tell me I don't belong in a public school gymnasium. Preacher Jones remained seated, but his voice carried across the space with the trained projection of someone who delivered sermons to congregations and briefings to battalions. Korea, Chosin Reservoir, 1951. I'm 70 years old. You planning to drag me out in handcuffs, son mom? Maria Chen stood next, and her voice carried an edge that suggested she was done being patient with people who made assumptions based on insufficient information. Iraq, Abu Ghraib Prison, 2004. Military police. I processed detainees while people threw rocks at our convoy. This jacket doesn't make me a criminal. It makes me part of a family that understands service. Morrison's face had gone through several color changes, from anger to confusion to something that might have been shame if he'd had time to process what was happening. Reynolds released his arm, stepped back, and her command voice carried the weight of someone who'd had enough of subordinates making situations worse. Officer Morrison, stand down. The gymnasium doors opened again, and 2 Phoenix PD officers entered with the purposeful stride of people responding to a potential situation that might require force, but hoping it wouldn't. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez led 45, and carrying herself with the competence that came from 20 years of dealing with every variety of human stupidity the city could produce. Officer Tim Rhodes followed, younger and visibly more nervous, his hand resting near his service weapon, in a way that suggested he'd been told this was a gang situation and had prepared himself accordingly. Gonzalez scanned the room with eyes that missed nothing, taking in the assembled Iron Brotherhood members, the security officers. Reynolds' military bearing, and Gunner sitting perfectly still in the center of what was either a crisis or just an uncomfortable gathering, depending on how you define the terms. She walked directly to Reynolds, ignoring Morrison entirely, and her voice carried the professional courtesy of one veteran speaking to another. I'm Sergeant Gonzalez. Someone called in gang activity. Reynolds' expression suggested she was restraining the urge to say several things that would be inappropriate in front of 300 witnesses. There's been a misunderstanding. These individuals are veterans attending a graduation ceremony. One of my officers may have overreacted. Gonzalez turned to face the assembled riders, her eyes tracking across service patches and campaign ribbons and the visible evidence of people who'd given pieces of themselves to military service. When her gaze landed on the Medal of Honor ribbon on Mateo Reyes's chest, she actually straightened into something approaching attention. That's a Medal of Honor. Mateo nodded, uncomfortable with the recognition, the way recipients always were, like being singled out for surviving when others didn't, felt more like accusation than honor. Afghanistan, 2009. I'd rather not discuss it. Gonzalez processed this, and Gunner watched her reassess the entire situation through the lens of new information. She turned to Chains, who sat behind Gunner with the patient stillness of someone who'd outlasted younger men in contests of will. "Sir, what's your name?" "Raymond Walker. People call me Chains." "Mr. Walker, can you explain why 12 members of a motorcycle club just entered a middle school graduation?" Chains stood, and the movement carried dignity rather than threat. When he spoke, his voice held the measured cadence of someone who'd learned to choose words carefully because they mattered more than volume. "My brother there," he gestured to Gunner, "is attending his daughter's graduation. Security asked him to leave because his jacket made people uncomfortable. We're here to ensure he can stay because we don't leave brothers behind. That's the code we live by." Gonzalez looked at Gunner, taking in the Marine Corps patch and the prosthetic leg that was more visible now that he'd stood when Reynolds first approached. Her expression shifted from professional assessment to something closer to understanding. "And if I ask you all to leave," Doc Williams spoke from where he stood, his voice carrying 76 years of life, lived according to principles that predated motorcycle clubs by several decades. "Ma'am, with respect, no, I'm not breaking any laws. I'm sitting in a public school attending a ceremony. If you arrest me for that, it's your choice, but I'm not leaving." Preacher Jones added his voice to the chorus, calm and implacable. "I'm 70, Korea. Same answer. Arrest me if you must, but I fought for the right to sit where I choose." Officer Rhodes stepped forward, his youth and inexperience evident in the way he tried to assert authority he hadn't yet earned. "We can arrest all of you for trespassing." Principal Rebecca Hayes's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel through infected tissue. She descended from the stage while the confrontation developed, and now she stood with her arms crossed in an expression that suggested she was done letting other people make decisions about her school. "Officers, this is a public event. They're not trespassing." Rhodes turned to her, his frustration evident. "They're causing a disturbance." "No, Officer Rhodes. Some families are choosing to be disturbed, which is different. These individuals are sitting quietly. They're not threatening anyone. They're not disrupting the ceremony. They're just present, and some people don't like what their presence represents." Gonzalez held up one hand, stopping Rhodes before he could dig the hole deeper. She looked at Hayes with the respect one professional extended to another when they both understood the situation had complexities that couldn't be resolved through simple enforcement. "Principal Hayes, what do you want us to do?" Hayes surveyed the gymnasium, her eyes tracking across the families who remained seated and the ones who'd gathered near the exits with the clear intention of leaving if this got any worse. She looked at Sarah on the stage, saw the 12-year-old's face tight with anxiety and pride and fear all tangled together. When Hayes spoke again, her voice carried to every corner of the space. "I want you to let them stay. I will not discriminate against veterans because their appearance makes people uncomfortable." Morrison finally found his voice, and the bitterness in it suggested this had become personal in ways that went beyond just doing his job. "They're glorifying Vassalain de Ramon. That jacket, those patches." Gunner turned to face him fully for the first time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. "This jacket represents brotherhood, same as my uniform did. You have a problem with that, Officer Morrison. My uncle wore uniforms, wore cuts, died alone in a garage with a gun because the Brotherhood didn't save him from what the war did to his head." The confession landed in the space between them like a live grenade, and suddenly the hostility made sense in ways it hadn't before. Gunner's hand moved to his pocket, found the challenge coin, gripped it while he chose his next words with the care they deserved. "Your uncle, what was his name?" "David Morrison, Marines, Kuwait." The gymnasium noise seemed to recede, and Gunner was back in the desert watching a 19-year-old kid drag him away from a burning Humvee, feeling Morrison's hands under his arms, and hearing his voice screaming for a medic. The memory had weight that present moment couldn't match, and when Gunner spoke again, his voice carried grief that 34 years hadn't managed to fully process. "Private Morrison saved my life, pulled me from the Humvee after the IED hit. I didn't know he'd died, I'm sorry." Jake Morrison's face went through several transformations, anger giving way to confusion, giving way to something that might have been the beginning of understanding if given time to develop. Reynolds put her hand on his arm, and her voice came gentle in a way that suggested they'd had this conversation before. "Jake, this is the sergeant your uncle wrote about. The one who lost his leg saving that Kuwaiti family. Jake looked at Gunner's prosthetic leg, at the challenge coin visible in his hand, at the Marine Corps patch that connected them through a dead man's memory. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its aggressive edge, replaced by something rawer and more honest. Uncle David's letters, he made you sound like a hero. Said you did the right thing even when it cost you everything. He was wrong. I did what needed doing. Your uncle was the hero. He had every right to leave me there to save himself. He didn't. That's what brotherhood means. Chain stood moved to stand beside Gunner, and his presence suggested this conversation was about to expand beyond just two men working through complicated grief. Son, whatever your uncle went through after the war, I'm sorry. A lot of brothers didn't make it home even when their bodies came back. But don't blame the code. The code is what kept him alive, as long as it did. Blame the war. Blame the politicians who sent us there. Blame the VA that couldn't give him the help he needed. But don't blame the men who tried to save him. Jake Morrison stood without responding, turned and walked toward the gymnasium exit with his shoulders tight and his hands clenched. Reynolds watched him go, and her face showed the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting this particular battle for years without winning. Gonzalez holstered her radio, made a decision visible in the way her posture relaxed. Officers, we're done here. No laws being broken, no disturbance requiring police intervention. Principal Hayes has made her decision, and it's her school. Rhodes started to protest, but Gonzalez cut him off with a look that suggested this wasn't up for debate. They moved toward the exit, and Gonzalez paused next to Gunner on her way out. Thank you for your service, Marine. Same to you, Sergeant. The police departure shifted the energy in the gymnasium, but the tension remained like humidity after rain. Families near the front had watched the entire confrontation with phones raised and expressions ranging from supportive to scandalized. The exodus began slowly, a few families gathering their belongings and heading for the exits with tight faces and whispered conversations that were clearly about whether staying was worth the discomfort. A father in his 30s hustled his wife and two children toward the door, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby people to hear. This isn't safe. I'm not risking my kids. Another mother followed, clutching her purse like it might be stolen if she didn't maintain constant vigilance. I can't believe they're allowing this. What kind of message does this send? But others stayed. An elderly couple near the front actually moved closer to where the Iron Brotherhood sat, the old man's eyes fixed on Chain's Korean war patch with something that looked like recognition. Honey, that man's a Korea vet, same as your father was. The woman smiled, genuine warmth replacing whatever nervousness she'd felt initially. Then we're staying right here. Emma Chen's mother, who'd made the comment last week about Gunner being dangerous, approached Sarah on the stage. Her face showed the complicated expression of someone trying to reconcile assumptions with evidence, and when she spoke, her voice carried contrition. Sarah, I owe you an apology. I judged your father without knowing him. That was wrong. On stage, Sarah's hands had finally stopped shaking. She stood straighter than she had before, her eyes finding her father's across the gymnasium with an understanding that hadn't existed an hour ago. Emma leaned close to her, whispered something that made Sarah smile, and the fear that had dominated her expression transformed into something closer to pride. Hayes returned to the microphone, tapped it twice to get everyone's attention. The feedback squeal cut through the remaining conversations, and 300 people turned their focus back to the front where the principal stood with her hands gripping the podium edge. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight for our students. Whatever personal feelings we have, whatever discomfort we experience, these young people have worked hard and deserve our recognition. She paused, let the words settle, then continued with steel underneath the professional courtesy. I see veterans in this room, men and women who served our country. I will not dishonor their service by treating them as threats simply because they choose to wear leather instead of polyester. If anyone disagrees with this decision, you're free to leave. But the ceremony continues. Applause started slowly, uncertain at first, then building as more hands joined in. Not universal. Plenty of families sat with arms crossed and faces set, but enough that the sound filled the gymnasium with something that felt like validation. The elderly couple clapped enthusiastically. Emma's father, who'd been silent through the confrontation, stood and applauded. Brian Torres, the Afghanistan vet Gunner had met outside, rose and clapped until his prosthetic hand and his real hand made noise together. Chains leaned forward, his voice low enough that only Gunnar heard. "Your girl's watching. Show her what standing tall looks like." Gunnar's hand found the challenge coin in his pocket, felt Elena's presence in the worn brass like she was sitting beside him instead of 2 years in the ground. He'd promised to be here, promised to show up regardless of cost, promised Sarah would see a father who kept his word even when the world tried to make that word inconvenient. The promises felt heavier now than they had in the hospice room, weighted with the understanding that principles only mattered when defending them required sacrifice. Hayes began reading from the program, her voice settling into the practiced rhythm of someone who'd presided over these ceremonies enough times to have the cadence memorized. Names started getting called, students crossing the stage in alphabetical order, and the normality of it felt surreal after everything that had just happened. Michael Anderson, a boy with red hair and too much gel, walked across the stage, shook Hayes's hand, accepted his certificate. His parents cheered from the fourth row, and the moment was perfectly ordinary, the kind of thing that happened at graduations everywhere, regardless of the drama that had preceded it. Ashley Martinez, a girl in a yellow dress, stumbled slightly on the steps, recovered with the resilience of 12-year-olds who hadn't yet learned embarrassment was supposed to last. Her grandmother stood and hollered encouragement that made half the room smile and the other half wince. The ceremony proceeded. Name after name, student after student, the rhythm building into something that felt almost meditative. Gunnar watched without speaking, his hands still on his knees, the challenge coin pressed into his palm, hard enough that the engraving would leave marks in his skin. Around him, the 12 members of the Iron Brotherhood sat with the same stillness, their presence no longer threatening, because threat required movement, and they'd mastered the art of being utterly, completely still. Mateo sat 3 seats to Gunnar's right, and his eyes tracked the exits with the professional assessment of someone who'd learned threat evaluation in places where mistakes got people killed. Big Mike lounged in the row behind his size, making the folding chair creak with every breath, but his face carried the gentle expression of someone watching kids celebrate achievements and remembering when his own children had been this age. Doc Williams had his arms crossed, but the posture wasn't defensive. He looked like someone settling in for a long wait, prepared to sit until the ceremony ended, and beyond if necessary, because patience was a skill you learned when survival required staying put, regardless of how uncomfortable the situation got. Jennifer Chen, Emma's older sister, crossed the stage, and Emma's father, who ran the Chinese restaurant on McDowell Road, where Gunnar sometimes picked up dinner, stood and cheered with unrestrained enthusiasm. Emma's mother joined him, and their pride was pure and uncomplicated, the kind of parental love that transcended whatever reservations they'd had about the man in the motorcycle cut, sitting several rows away. The names continued. Each one marked another step closer to Sarah, and Gunnar felt time compress in that peculiar way it did when you were waiting for something that mattered. His pulse stayed steady, but his awareness sharpened, every sense focused on the moment that was approaching with mathematical inevitability. David Foster. A boy walked across the stage alone, no family in the audience, and the applause for him came softer, more scattered. The grandmother sitting in the front row clapped hard enough to make up for the absent parents, but the emptiness was visible in the way the boy's shoulders hunched slightly as he accepted his certificate and hurried off stage. Gunnar thought about all the promises people made and broke about fathers who were supposed to show up and didn't, about the visible absence that shaped kids just as much as presence did. Sarah would never have that absence. He'd made sure of it through every parent-teacher conference and school play and science fair since Elena died, showing up with his prosthetic leg and his motorcycle cut because being present mattered more than being comfortable. Brandon Lee, a boy with glasses thick enough to magnify his eyes, crossed the stage, and the elderly veteran grandfather who'd moved closer to the Iron Brotherhood earlier stood and cheered with the kind of volume that suggested his hearing wasn't what it used to be. The boy's face split into a grin, and he waved at his grandfather with unself-conscious affection. The old man sat back down, caught Chains's eye, and nodded with the recognition that passed between people who'd served in different wars but understood the same principles. Chains nodded back, and the exchange held more meaning than any conversation could have conveyed. Hayes turned the page in her program, and Gunnar knew without counting that Sarah's name was coming soon. The alphabet was relentless in its order, McKenna falling in the middle of the M's, close enough now that Gunnar could feel his heart rate climbing despite his best efforts to maintain the calm he'd cultivated over 58 years of learning to manage himself. Behind him, chains shifted slightly, and Gunnar felt rather than heard his brother's attention sharpen. The other Iron Brotherhood members made small adjustments in their positions, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching for it, but clear signals to anyone who understood body language. They were preparing, getting ready for whatever came next, because Sarah's moment was everyone's moment, and they would honor it the way brothers honored things that mattered. On stage, Sarah stood in her position, second row from the front, fifth from the left. Her hands gripped the certificate holder they had all been given, and Gunnar could see her knuckles white even from this distance. Emma stood beside her, whispered something that made Sarah nod, and the two girls shared a look that spoke to whatever friendship had developed over years of classes and lunch periods and the complicated social dynamics of being 12. Hayes read another name, another student crossed the stage, and the gap between present moment and Sarah's turn narrowed to seconds rather than minutes. Gunnar's thumb moved across the challenge coin's surface, feeling the eagle globe and anchor on one side, and the Semper Fidelis inscription on the other. And he thought about Elena asking him to promise about the weight of keeping promises. When they cost you something about teaching Sarah through action, what words could never adequately convey. Kevin Rogers. 3 more names. Gunnar counted them off mentally, marking time until the moment arrived that he'd been preparing for since the moment Elena made him swear he'd be at every milestone. This was why he'd refused to move when Reynolds asked. Why he'd sat still when Morrison threatened. Why 12 brothers had ridden across Phoenix to stand beside him when the world suggested leaving would be easier. Because promises meant something. Because showing up mattered. Because Sarah needed to see that her father's word was absolute regardless of who tried to challenge it. Laura Mendez. 2 names. The gymnasium had gone quieter, or maybe Gunnar's perception had narrowed until the ambient noise became background static against the approaching moment. His breathing stayed even through conscious effort, the same discipline he'd learned in the Marines when staying calm under pressure meant the difference between living and dying. This wasn't combat, but the principles translated: control what you could control, accept what you couldn't, stay present in the moment, regardless of how much your mind wanted to jump ahead. Robert Martinez. 1 name. Sarah shifted on the risers, her eyes finding Gunnar's across the distance, and in that eye contact was everything they'd built together over 12 years of her life and 2 years of Elena's absence. Trust, love, the understanding that he would always be exactly where he said he would be because his word was the only thing he owned that couldn't be taken away by IEDs or cancer or security guards with radios. Hayes looked down at her program, and Gunnar saw the moment she registered whose name came next. Her eyes lifted, found him in the 3rd row, surrounded by leather and patches and 12 brothers who'd ridden through Phoenix traffic to be present for a 12-year-old girl's graduation. Something passed across Hayes' face, recognition perhaps of what this moment meant beyond just ceremony, and when she spoke again, her voice carried extra weight. Sarah Marie McKenna. The name hit Gunnar's chest like something physical. He felt Chain's hand come to rest briefly on his shoulder, felt the shift as all 12 Iron Brotherhood members went from still to absolutely motionless. And then he was rising from his seat before conscious thought directed the movement. His legs lifted him, the real one, and the prosthetic working together the way they'd learned to over 34 years, and he stood in the 3rd row of Redwood Middle School gymnasium while his daughter walked across the stage to accept her diploma. Behind him, Chain stood. Beside Chain's, Doc Williams rose with his 76 years and his silver star and his refusal to hide. Preacher Jones stood with the careful deliberation of a 70-year-old man whose knees didn't bend like they used to, but whose spine remained parade ground straight. The wave moved through the Iron Brotherhood members like water, each person rising in turn until all 12 stood in their scattered positions throughout the seating area. Not synchronized, not choreographed, just the natural movement of people who understood what the moment meant and chose to honor it with their physical presence. Then something unexpected happened. The elderly grandfather, the Korea veteran who'd moved closer earlier, stood. His wife rose beside him. Brian Torres stood in the back row, his prosthetic hand visible as he raised both arms slightly in a gesture that was part respect and part solidarity. Emma Chen's father stood, followed by her mother, followed by Emma's grandmother, who'd been clapping loudest all night. The standing spread like ripples in water. Not everyone, plenty of families remained seated with arms crossed and faces set in disapproval, but enough that the gesture became something larger than just one motorcycle club supporting their brother. 50 people standing became 75, became 100, and the sound of chairs scraping and people rising filled the gymnasium with acoustic evidence that not everyone found the Iron Brotherhood's presence threatening. Sarah reached center stage, accepted her certificate from Hayes with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The principal leaned in, whispered something that Gunnar couldn't hear from his position, but that made Sarah smile. And then Sarah was turning to face the audience with her diploma in one hand and her medal in the other, and pride evident in every line of her posture. Her eyes found Gunnar immediately locked onto him with the kind of focus that shut out everything else in the gymnasium. He stood in the third row surrounded by his brothers, his challenge coin pressed into his palm, his prosthetic leg visible, and his Marine Corps patch catching the fluorescent light, and he understood with perfect clarity that this moment was what Elena had been talking about when she'd made him promise to show up. Not just physically present, but truly present. Not hiding, not apologizing, not making himself smaller to accommodate other people's discomfort. Standing tall, keeping his word. Being exactly who he was without shame or hesitation, because Sarah needed to see that some things were worth defending regardless of cost. Gunnar touched his chest where the challenge coin rested in his breast pocket, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. Sarah understood. Her smile widened, became something incandescent that transformed her face from nervous child to confident young woman, and she raised her diploma slightly in acknowledgement. The applause that followed wasn't unanimous, but it was real. Hands clapped with genuine enthusiasm, and the sound filled the gymnasium with something that felt like vindication. Not everyone understood why 13 people in leather cuts and military patches had just made a 12-year-old's graduation about something larger than school achievement. But enough people understood. Enough people stood. Enough people chose to see the father keeping his promise instead of the stereotype threatening their comfort. Hayes gestured for Sarah to proceed off stage, and the girl walked with her head high and her shoulders back and every bit of her mother's strength evident in her bearing. When she disappeared into the wings where students congregated after receiving their diplomas, Gunnar sat back down and the wave of movement reversed itself as the Iron Brotherhood members returned to their seats. The ceremony continued. More names got called. More students crossed the stage and the world kept turning, because that's what the world did, regardless of how significant individual moments felt to the people living them. But something had shifted in the gymnasium's atmosphere, a recognition that the confrontation had resolved itself in a way that nobody had predicted, but everyone would remember. Chains leaned forward again, his voice carrying just to Gunnar's ears. Elena would be proud, brother. Gunnar's jaw tightened, his throat constricting around words that wouldn't form properly. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and Chains understood the way brothers understood things that went beyond language. The hand on his shoulder squeezed once, then withdrew, and they sat together in the third row while the rest of the sixth grade class received their diplomas and the evening wound toward its conclusion. Jake Morrison stood in the hallway outside the gymnasium, his back against the wall, and his hands shaking with something that might have been anger and might have been grief and was probably both. He'd watched the entire confrontation from the doorway after walking out, had seen the veterans stand and the families join them, and Sergeant McKenna's face when his daughter crossed the stage. The image wouldn't leave his mind, wouldn't stop overlaying itself with memories of his Uncle David talking about brotherhood and honor and the code that kept Marines alive when everything else tried to kill them. His phone was in his hand before he consciously decided to make the call. The number connected rang twice and then a voice answered that he hadn't heard in 3 years. David Morrison, Memorial VA Support Line. This is Christine. How can I help you? Jake's throat closed around the words, and for several seconds, he couldn't speak past the tightness. Christine waited with the patience of someone who'd fielded these calls before, who understood that sometimes people needed time to find their voice. I think I need to talk to someone about my uncle, about what happened to him. I'm here. Take your time. Inside the gymnasium, Hayes read the final name and the ceremony concluded with the traditional cap toss that sent squares of blue fabric flying toward the ceiling, where they hung suspended for a moment before gravity reasserted itself and brought everything back down. Students cheered, parents applauded, and the formal structure dissolved into celebration as families surged forward to find their graduates and teachers herded everyone toward the exits. Gunnar remained seated while the chaos swirled around him. The Iron Brotherhood members stood in sequence, preparing to depart the way they'd arrived together, deliberate without fanfare. Doc Williams approached first, extended his hand, and Gunnar took it with the grip that veterans shared when words felt inadequate. Your daughter's a credit to you, Gunnar. She's her mother's daughter. She's got your spine. That matters. One by one, the others filed past. Handshakes, nods, the occasional embrace that conveyed more than speech could manage. Mateo paused, his Medal of Honor ribbon catching the light one final time. You stood your ground tonight. That's what we do. Appreciate you coming. That's what brothers do. We don't leave people behind. They moved toward the exit in their staggered formation, and Gunnar watched them go with the understanding that tonight had been about more than just one graduation. It had been about principles defended, about standing firm when the easier choice was retreat, about teaching Sarah through action what manhood looked like when it was stripped of ego and reduced to its essential components. Sarah appeared through the crowd, diploma in one hand and medal around her neck, her face flushed with excitement and relief and a dozen other emotions she probably didn't have names for yet. She launched herself at Gunnar, and he caught her with arms that had held her since she was born and would keep holding her until one of them stopped breathing. Dad, you kept your promise. Always will, baby girl. They tried to make you leave. I know. But you didn't. His hand found the challenge coin in his pocket, pulled it out where Sarah could see it. The brass caught the gymnasium lights, and the inscription was visible when he turned it over, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Your mom made me promise I'd be at every milestone. I told her I would. A man's word is all he has that can't be taken away, Sarah. Everything else, legs, lives, comfort, can be lost. But your word, that's yours to keep or break, and nobody else gets a say. Sarah looked at this coin, then at her father, and something ancient passed between them that connected her to Elena and Gunnar and every generation of McKennas who'd learned that principles mattered more than convenience. Can we go home now? Yeah, kiddo, let's go home. The gymnasium floor had transformed from orderly ceremony to controlled chaos within seconds of the final cap hitting the ground. 300 people moved in competing directions, parents searching for their graduates, while teachers tried to maintain some semblance of organization and students celebrated with the kind of uninhibited joy that came from being officially done with elementary school. The air conditioning system struggled against the collective body heat, and somewhere near the stage, a student had managed to start playing music from a portable speaker that would probably get confiscated in the next 60 seconds. Gunnar stood near the side exit where he'd been sitting, letting the crowd flow around him rather than fighting against the current. The Iron Brotherhood members had already departed, their presence dissolving into the parking lot where 12 motorcycles waited to carry them back to whatever Thursday evening plans they had interrupted to be here. Only the memory of them remained and the changed atmosphere that their standing had created. Emma Chen appeared through the press of bodies, dragging Sarah by the hand with the determined focus of someone on a mission. Emma's parents followed at a more measured pace, and Gunnar recognized the expression on Mrs. Chen's face as the look of someone who'd decided to overcome their discomfort through direct confrontation with the source of it. Emma released Sarah's hand, bounced slightly on her toes with the excess energy 12-year-olds generated like static electricity. Mr. McKenna, that was so cool. When all those bikers stood up, it was like a movie. Sarah made a noise that was half mortification and half laughter, but Emma's enthusiasm was difficult to resist. Gunnar found himself smiling despite the exhaustion that was starting to settle into his bones now that the adrenaline was fading. They're veterans, Emma. Most of them served before you were born. My grandpa was in Vietnam. He has a jacket kind of like yours, but he doesn't wear it much anymore. Says it doesn't fit right. Mrs. Chen reached them, and her hands twisted together in a gesture that mirrored Sarah's nervous habit so perfectly that Gunnar wondered if the girls had picked it up from each other. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful deliberation of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times and was determined to get through it without backing down. Mr. McKenna, I owe you an apology. Gunnar started to respond that it wasn't necessary, but Mrs. Chen raised one hand in a gesture that asked for patience. Please let me say this. Last week I made a comment to Sarah about whether you were dangerous. That was unfair and based on assumptions I had no right to make. People make assumptions. It's natural. No, it's lazy thinking. My father was a Marine, served in Korea. He would have been ashamed of me tonight if he'd heard what I said. Mr. Chen stepped forward, his hand extended, and Gunnar shook it with the firm grip that small business owners develop from decades of customer interaction. We'd like to take both girls for ice cream, if that's acceptable. There's a place on Camelback that stays open late. Sarah looked up at Gunnar with an expression that clearly communicated hope while trying not to seem too desperate about it. He thought about going home to an empty house, about sitting in the garage with Mr. Chen's carburetor for company, about the way Elena used to insist that celebrating achievements mattered just as much as achieving them in the first place. Sarah's call, "You want to go, kiddo? Can you come too, Dad?" The question shouldn't have surprised him, but it did. He'd assumed Sarah would want time with Emma away from the father who just turned her graduation into something more complicated than she'd anticipated. The fact that she wanted him shifted something in his chest that he didn't have words to name. "If Mr. and Mrs. Chen don't mind." Mrs. Chen's smile looked genuine this time, carrying none of the tightness that had marked her expression the last time they'd spoken at parent pickup. "We'd be honored, Mr. McKenna. You can follow us there." They separated in the parking lot, the Chen family climbing into a minivan that had seen better decades while Gunnar and Sarah walked toward his F-150. The evening heat had finally started to break, the temperature dropping from oppressive to merely uncomfortable as the sun finished its descent behind the western mountains. Desert crickets had started their nightly chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed its way toward whatever emergency demanded its presence. Sarah's hand found his as they walked, her small fingers wrapping around his larger ones, and Gunnar was struck by how rare this had become. She was 12, rapidly approaching the age where holding her father's hand in public would become embarrassing rather than comforting. He savored the contact while it lasted, knowing that childhood ended in increments too small to notice until you looked back and realized the person beside you had transformed into someone new. They'd made it halfway across the parking lot when Gunnar saw Jake Morrison leaning against a pickup truck near the edge of the lot. The security officer had changed out of his uniform, now wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that hung untucked in a way that suggested he'd dressed in a hurry or without caring much about his appearance. His arms were crossed, but the posture read more as uncertain than defensive. Sarah felt Gunnar's stride hesitate, followed his gaze to where Morrison stood, and her hand tightened on his. "Dad, is he going to try again?" "I don't think so. Stay with the Chen's truck. I'll be right there." He walked toward Morrison with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to assess situations before committing to a course of action. Morrison pushed off from his truck as Gunnar approached, his hands coming uncrossed to hang at his sides in a gesture that was clearly meant to signal non-threat. They stood 6 feet apart in the parking lot, with the gymnasium lights casting long shadows and the sound of families celebrating filtering through the evening air. Morrison spoke first, his voice carrying none of the aggression that had marked their earlier interaction. "Mr. McKenna, I need to talk to you if you have time." "About what?" "About my uncle, about why I've been angry at men like you for 20 years. Gunnar glanced back toward where Sarah waited near the Chen's minivan, saw Mrs. Chen standing beside her with one protective hand on her shoulder. He pulled out his phone, sent a quick text to Sarah. "Give me 5 minutes. Order me whatever you're getting. We'll meet you there." Sarah's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, then at her father, and nodded with the kind of understanding that shouldn't have been possible at 12, but somehow was anyway. The Chen family loaded into their minivan and pulled out of the parking lot, and Gunnar turned his full attention back to Morrison. 5 minutes. Then I need to go." Morrison nodded, started walking toward the far edge of the lot where the lights didn't reach quite as well, and the noise from the gymnasium became more distant. Gunnar followed, his prosthetic leg handling the uneven asphalt with the practiced efficiency that came from decades of learning to navigate terrain that wasn't designed for artificial limbs. They reached the boundary fence, and Morrison stopped with his hands shoved in his pockets and his shoulders tight with tension that he was trying to hide. When he finally spoke, the words came out rougher than he probably intended. "My uncle David Morrison was your Private Morrison, Kuwait 91. I know, your Aunt Laura told me earlier. He wrote letters home during the war, talked about his sergeant who disobeyed orders to save a Kuwaiti family, said you lost your leg because you chose 4 civilians over following procedure." Gunnar's hand found his pocket, touched the challenge coin through the fabric, and the worn brass connected him to a desert morning 34 years removed from this parking lot conversation. I made a judgment call. Kids were going to die if we waited for air support. Your uncle and the rest of my squad backed that call even though they knew it could cost them. Morrison's face worked through several expressions before settling on something that looked like pain, trying to masquerade as anger. He came home different. Nightmares every night. Couldn't hold down jobs because loud noises made him panic. Started drinking to cope, stopped when my aunt threatened to leave, then just got quieter and quieter, until one day he went into the garage and didn't come out. The words landed in the space between them with the weight of old grief that had never properly been processed. Gunnar had heard variations of this story before, had known brothers who'd survived the war, only to lose the battle with what the war did to their minds. The guilt that came with surviving when others didn't was a poison that had no antidote, just time and support, and the hope that eventually the weight would become bearable rather than crushing. How old were you when he died? 25. Old enough to know better, young enough to blame the wrong things. And you've been blaming the Corps, the Brotherhood, the Corps. Morrison's voice cracked slightly, the professional security officer facade finally breaking enough to let the grieving nephew show through. I blamed the parts of him that I couldn't understand. The Marine stuff, the honor and duty, and Semper Fi that he talked about even when it was killing him. I watched him choose that code over getting real help, over admitting he was broken, over asking for the support he needed. Gunnar let the silence stretch, gave Morrison space to continue if he needed to, or stop if he couldn't. The parking lot had mostly emptied, just a few stragglers loading into vehicles and heading home to whatever celebrations or obligations waited. The gymnasium lights started going dark in sequence as staff began the process of securing the building for the night. Your uncle didn't die because of the code, Jake. He died because the war broke something inside him that nobody knew how to fix. The Brotherhood tried. We always try. But sometimes the damage goes too deep and trying isn't enough. Morrison pulled something from his pocket, and in the dim light, Gunnar could see it was a photograph, edges worn from years of being carried. He held it out and Gunnar took it, carefully angled it to catch enough illumination to make out the details. 6 Marines stood in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but smiling anyway because they'd survived another day, and that counted as victory. Gunnar recognized himself immediately, 25 years old and whole, his left leg still attached, and his future still something that extended beyond medical discharge. Morrison stood beside him, young and earnest, and carrying the kind of optimism that war hadn't yet beaten out of him. He kept this photo in his wallet, wrote on the back, "My squad, my brothers, best of men I ever knew." Gunnar turned the photo over, read the faded inscription in handwriting he didn't remember, but that carried Morrison's voice anyway. The words blurred slightly, and he realized his eyes had gone damp in a way they rarely did anymore, because he'd learned to lock that particular door most of the time. Your uncle was a good Marine, saved my life. I didn't know he'd struggled afterward, and I'm sorry nobody could help him through it. Were you close in the war? The question required more complicated answer than Morrison probably expected. Gunnar handed the photo back, gave himself time to find words that were honest without being cruel. We were squad. That's different than close. I was his sergeant, which meant I was responsible for keeping him alive and turning him into someone who could keep himself alive. We shared the same hell for a few months, and that creates a bond that people who haven't experienced it can't really understand. Is that what the Iron Brotherhood is trying to recreate, that bond? The Brotherhood is about having people who understand when you can't explain. Your uncle needed that after the war. Sounds like maybe he found some version of it, even if it wasn't enough. Morrison folded the photograph carefully, returned it to his wallet, and his next words came out quieter than everything before. 6 Marines came to his funeral. I didn't know any of them. They stood in the back, didn't introduce themselves, just paid their respects and left. I was so angry at them for not saving him that I didn't think to thank them for showing up. They were there because leaving a brother behind at his funeral would have been unthinkable. Even if they couldn't save him while he was alive, they could honor him when he was gone. That's the code. I've spent 20 years being angry at the wrong people. Gunnar's hand rested on Morrison's shoulder, brief contact that carried more weight than extended conversation could have managed. Grief makes us stupid sometimes. Makes us look for someone to blame because Random suffering is harder to process than suffering that has a target. Your uncle would understand. He'd probably forgive you before you finished apologizing. Morrison's face crumpled slightly, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, and he wiped them away with the back of his hand in a gesture that was pure frustrated masculinity trying to maintain composure. I called the VA crisis line after I walked out of the ceremony. First time I've talked to anyone about Uncle David in years. That's good. That's really good, Jake. They said I should come to the support group. Families of veterans who died by suicide. Meetings Tuesday nights. Will you go? Morrison looked at him, really looked, and something in his expression suggested he was seeing Gunnar clearly for the first time instead of through the filter of assumptions and unprocessed grief. Yeah, I think I will. They walked back toward the remaining vehicles together, and the silence between them had shifted from hostile to something closer to understanding. Morrison stopped at his truck, turned back one final time. Mr. McKenna, I'm sorry for how I treated you tonight, for what I assumed about you and your club. I was wrong. Apology accepted. You were protecting kids at a school. That's honorable work even when you're protecting them from threats that don't exist. Would it be appropriate for me to attend one of your Brotherhood meetings? Not to join, just to understand better what Uncle David was trying to find. Gunnar pulled a card from his wallet, one of the simple business cards the Phoenix chapter kept for exactly these situations. It had the clubhouse address, meeting times, and a phone number that would reach chains if someone needed to talk. Sunday afternoons, 2 o'clock. Bring your uncle's photo if you want. The older members might remember him. Morrison took the card, studied it like it contained answers to questions he was still figuring out how to ask. Thank you, genuinely. We take care of brothers. That extends to their families when we can. Gunnar climbed into his F-150 and pulled out of the parking lot with the kind of exhaustion that came from emotional labor rather than physical exertion. The drive to the ice cream place on Camelback took 15 minutes through Phoenix traffic that was starting to thin as evening settled into night. He found parking near the Chen's minivan, walked into the shop where Sarah and Emma sat in a corner booth with their parents and 3 different flavors of ice cream in sundae glasses that looked engineered to give children sugar rushes right before bedtime. Sarah had ordered him chocolate, which meant she'd remembered, despite everything else that had happened tonight. He slid into the booth next to her, and she automatically shifted closer so their shoulders touched. The contact was casual and comfortable, and represented more trust than all the standing ovations in the world could match. Chen leaned forward, her expression showing genuine curiosity rather than the careful politeness that marked conversations between acquaintances who were trying not to offend each other. Is everything all right with that security officer? It will be. He's working through some things. Needed to talk. That was generous of you, after how he treated you. Gunnar picked up the spoon Sarah had placed next to his sundae, took a bite of chocolate ice cream that was cold enough to make his teeth ache. Everyone's fighting battles you can't see. Sometimes the right response is grace instead of grudges. Mr. Chen nodded, and the gesture carried the weight of someone who'd made similar calculations in his own life. My father used to say something similar. He was Taiwanese Army before he immigrated. Said American Marines were the best men he'd ever met, but also the most broken by what they had seen. The conversation shifted to easier topics after that graduation next year for Emma Middle School orientation coming up in August, whether the girls wanted to try out for volleyball or stick with academic clubs. Gunnar participated when directly addressed, but mostly just listened, watching Sarah laugh with Emma about something that 12-year-olds found hilarious and adults couldn't quite track. He thought about Elena, about how she would have loved this moment, not the confrontation at graduation, but this afterward part where Sarah got to be just a kid eating ice cream with her best friend while her father sat nearby and provided the stable background presence that allowed children to feel safe enough to be silly. Elena had been better at these social situations, had known instinctively how to navigate conversations that Gunnar still approached, like tactical problems requiring careful planning. They stayed until those girls had finished their ice cream and started the inevitable negotiation about whether they could get one more scoop. Mrs. Chen shut that down with the practiced firmness of someone who knew exactly how much sugar to allow before the consequences became everyone's problem. The families separated in the parking lot with promises that Sarah and Emma would see each other at orientation and maybe get together before then if schedules allowed. Gunnar and Sarah drove home in comfortable silence, the kind that came from spending enough time together that constant conversation wasn't necessary. The radio played low, something that might have been Tom Petty or might have been someone else from the same era when classic rock was just called rock. Sarah's hand played with her diploma, touching the embossed seal and running her fingers across her name, printed in formal script. The house was dark when they arrived, the automatic timer having not yet triggered the porch light. Gunnar unlocked the door and they entered the space that had been home for 12 years, but still felt incomplete in ways that 2 years hadn't managed to fix. Elena's absence was everywhere and nowhere, written into the arrangement of furniture she'd chosen, and the photographs on the walls, in the empty chair at the kitchen table where she used to sit and help Sarah with homework. Sarah headed toward her room to change out of her dress, and Gunnar made his way to the garage, where Mr. Chen's carburetor still waited on the workbench. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting their harsh illumination across tools and parts, and the organized chaos that had become his refuge when grief threatened to become larger than his ability to contain it. His phone buzzed, text from Chains. "You good, brother?" He typed back. "Yeah, Sarah's home. Ceremony went as well as could be expected. Better than expected. You stood tall. That matters. Thanks for coming. Meant more than I can say. That's what brothers do. See you Sunday." Gunnar set the phone down, picked up a brass jet that needed cleaning, and was working on it when Sarah appeared in the garage doorway, still wearing her dress, but with her shoes kicked off so her bare feet made no sound on the concrete floor. "Dad." "Yeah, kiddo. Can we talk before I change?" He set down the jet, gave her his full attention. Sarah crossed to his workbench, hoisted herself onto the stool where she'd sat earlier that afternoon, when the graduation had still been hours away and full of uncertain possibilities. "I'm sorry I asked you not to wear your jacket." "You were scared. That's understandable." "No, I was embarrassed. That's different. I was worried what people would think instead of being proud of who you are." The confession came out in a rush, like she'd been holding it in for hours and needed to expel it before it poisoned something. Gunnar moved closer, then stood in front of her, with his hands resting on her shoulders. "You're 12, figuring out who you are and what you believe is your job right now. Sometimes that means making mistakes. But you didn't make mistakes. You knew exactly who you were, and you didn't hide it even when everyone wanted you to. I've had 58 years to figure myself out. You're just getting started. Give yourself time." Sarah pulled the challenge coin from her dress pocket, where she'd apparently been carrying it since their earlier conversation. She held it in her palm, studying the engraving with the kind of intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize every detail. "Tell me about the coin. You promised you would." Gunnar took the coin from her hand, felt its familiar weight settle into his palm like coming home. The brass had darkened over the years, patina building up in the engraving, and giving it the appearance of something ancient and valuable beyond its material worth. "Your mom gave me this the day she got her cancer diagnosis. November 14th, 2002. Sarah's face showed the pain that memories of her mother's illness still triggered, but she didn't look away or ask him to stop. She'd learned in the past 2 years that grief required acknowledgement rather than avoidance. I'd given it to her back in '92, right after I got out of the hospital in Germany. Told her it was mine, but I wanted her to keep it safe until I needed it again. She kept it in her jewelry box for 30 years. Why did you need it again? Because your mom knew I'd need a reminder, something physical I could hold when everything else felt uncertain." He turned the coin over, showed Sarah the inscription on the back that had been there since it was minted in Nightsaw. "Semper Fidelis, always faithful." "This coin represents a promise, Sarah. Not just the promise I made to your mom about being at your graduations and milestones. A bigger promise about staying true to who you are, regardless of what the world tries to make you become." Sarah took the coin back, traced the letters with one finger. "What does it feel like to keep a promise when it costs you something?" The question was more complex than she probably realized, reaching into philosophy and ethics and the practical reality of living according to principles when convenience suggested otherwise. Gunnar thought about the gymnasium, about refusing to move when moving would have been easier, about 12 brothers riding across Phoenix because one of their own had needed them. "Cost me something. Tonight, they tried to make you leave. You could have avoided all the confrontation if you'd just moved to the back. And taught you what that promises don't matter when they're inconvenient, that your word only counts when keeping it is easy. Sarah absorbed this, her face showing the processing that happened when abstract concepts started connecting to concrete experience. Mom told me once that you were the most stubborn man she'd ever met, but she said it like it was a good thing. Gunnar felt his throat tighten, emotion rising faster than his defenses could contain. Elena had said that more times than he could count, usually with exasperation and affection in equal measure. Your mom understood that some things are worth being stubborn about. Promises, principles, the people you love. He reached out, took the coin back one more time, and his next words came slower as he worked through what he needed to say and how to say it. Sarah, this coin is yours now. Her eyes widened and she started to protest before the words fully formed. Dad, no, it's your coin, from the war, from Mom. It's our family's coin. It represents something bigger than me, or the Marines, or any single person. It's about the values we carry forward, the promises we keep, the word we give that becomes more important than comfort or safety or what anyone else thinks. He placed the coin in her palm, closed her fingers around it gently. One day you'll make a promise that costs you something. Maybe a friendship because you told an uncomfortable truth. Maybe a job because you wouldn't compromise your ethics. Maybe something bigger that I can't even imagine right now. Sarah's hand tightened around the coin, and her eyes reflected the gymnasium lights in a way that suggested tears threatening at the edges. When that day comes, you hold this coin. You remember your mom kept her promises even when cancer was killing her. Remember I kept mine even when security guards tried to make me leave. And you'll know that keeping your word is worth whatever it costs because your word is the only thing that's truly yours. The tears spilled over, then silent tracks down her cheeks that she didn't try to hide or wipe away. Gunnar pulled her into a hug, and she buried her face in his shoulder while her body shook with crying that had probably been building since the morning and finally found its release. What if I fail? What if I can't keep a promise? Then you get up and try again. That's the code, Sarah, not perfection, persistence, not never falling down but always getting back up. They stayed like that until her crying subsided into hiccups and then into the deep breaths that came after emotional release. When Sarah finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but her expression carried something that looked like peace. She turned the coin over in her hand one more time, found the inscription that had been there all along, but that she was seeing with new understanding. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. To your country, to your family, to your word, to yourself. I'll remember, Dad. I know you will. Sarah slid off the stool, clutched the coin in one hand like a talisman, and headed toward her room with the kind of purpose that suggested she had a specific place in mind to keep it. Gunnar watched her go, and the garage felt larger and emptier once she'd left it the way spaces always did when the people who mattered most departed. He returned to Mr. Chen's carburetor, but his heart wasn't in the work anymore. The brass jets could wait until tomorrow. The float bowl would still need adjusting whether he did it tonight or next week. Some things could be deferred when more important matters demanded attention. His phone rang. Chane's voice came through before Gunnar could say hello. You still up? Yeah, finishing work in the garage. How's Sarah? Good, better than good. She understands now, I think. Elena would be proud, brother. The words hit harder than they should have, and Gunnar had to swallow twice before he could trust his voice to respond without breaking. Hope so. Did my best. I know you did. That's all any of us can do. They talked for another few minutes about nothing important. Sunday's chapter meeting, the upcoming charity toy drive in December, whether Big Mike was actually going to retire from construction or if he'd keep finding excuses to work for another decade. The conversation was comfortable and meandering, and exactly what Gunnar needed after a night that had required more emotional energy than he'd anticipated spending. When he finally hung up and headed into the house, Sarah's bedroom light was still on. He paused outside her door, knocked softly. Come in. She sat at her desk with her diploma propped against the lamp and her medal hanging from the corner of her mirror. The challenge coin rested on a small stand she must have retrieved from somewhere positioned, so it caught the light and reflected it back in bronze highlights. You okay, kiddo? Yeah, just thinking. About about promises, about keeping your word, about being brave enough to stand up when everyone wants you to sit down. Gunnar leaned against the door frame, fatigue settling into his bones now that the day was winding toward its conclusion. Those are big thoughts for midnight on a Thursday. Mom used to say that the important stuff happens when you're not expecting it, that you don't get to choose when to be brave or when to keep your promises. You just have to be ready. Your mom was smart about a lot of things. Sarah picked up the coin, held it so the inscription caught the light one more time. I'm going to keep it right here, so I see it every morning and every night, so I don't forget what it means. That's good. That's really good, Sarah. He moved to leave, let her get ready for bed, but she called him back before he reached the hallway. Dad, thank you for tonight, for not leaving, for showing me what it looks like to stand tall. His throat closed around the response he wanted to give, so he settled for what he could manage. Always, baby girl. Always. The next 3 months passed with the kind of speed that only seemed possible in retrospect. Summer arrived with its characteristic Phoenix intensity, temperatures climbing past 115 degrees, and making outdoor activity and exercise and strategic planning around the hours when the sun turned asphalt into something that could melt shoe soles. Sarah spent her days at summer camp, came home with stories about swimming lessons and art projects, and the complex social dynamics of 12-year-olds learning to navigate friendships. Gunnar worked in his garage, rebuilt carburetors and transmissions, and anything else that required mechanical understanding rather than emotional processing. The Phoenix chapter rode every weekend long stretches of highway where the world reduced itself to pavement and ska and the rumble of engines that drowned out thoughts that tried too hard to be heard. Jake Morrison showed up at the clubhouse on a Sunday in mid-September, looking nervous and uncertain but present anyway. He brought his uncle's photograph, and 3 of the older members recognized Private David Morrison from Kuwait and spent an hour sharing stories that made Jake laugh and cry in alternating waves. He started coming regularly after that, not to join, but just to sit and listen, and slowly piece together an understanding of the code his uncle had lived by. When school started in August, Sarah gave a presentation in her social studies class titled Modern American Heroes. She'd assembled a poster board with photographs of Gunnar in his Marine uniform and his Iron Brotherhood cut pictures of Chains and Doc and Preacher with their service medals visible, and a blown-up image of the challenge coin with its Semper Fidelis inscription enlarged so everyone could read it. Her teacher called that evening to tell Gunnar that Sarah's presentation had been the most passionate and well-researched of the entire class, that she'd spoken about her father and his brothers with such pride that several students had asked follow-up questions about military service and what it meant to live according to a code. The teacher suggested Sarah might consider entering it in the school's Veterans Day presentation competition in November. Now in early December, Gunnar stood in the garage on a Saturday morning, helping Sarah put the finishing touches on the presentation she'd be delivering at the Veterans Day Assembly. She'd expanded it since the summer, adding interviews with Doc Williams about Vietnam and Preacher Jones about Korea, and her own reflections on what she'd learned from watching her father refuse to move from his seat at graduation. Dad, how do I explain what the Brotherhood means without making it sound like I'm just defending you? Gunnar looked up from where he was organizing wrenches by size, a task he performed periodically when he needed to think through complicated problems. Don't defend, just explain. Tell them what you saw that night. 12 men who rode across Phoenix because one of their own needed them. That's the Brotherhood. Actions, not words. Sarah typed something on her laptop, then read it aloud to test how it sounded. My dad's motorcycle club is 60% military veterans. These men fought for our country. They lost legs, arms, friends. They earned the right to wear any jacket they want, and they've earned our respect regardless of what stereotypes suggest. That's good, strong. But is it too strong? Mrs. Patterson said I should be balanced. Balance doesn't mean pretending both sides have equal merit. Sometimes one side is right and the other side is prejudiced. Your job is to present the truth clearly, not to make prejudice feel comfortable. She nodded, made a note, continued typing. Gunnar watched her work with the kind of pride that didn't need expression to be real. Sarah had grown in the 4 months since graduation, not physically so much as in bearing and confidence. She carried herself differently, now spoke with more certainty, seemed to have developed a spine that would serve her well in the decades ahead. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Then he realized it was Jake Morrison using his personal cell rather than the work number they'd exchanged. Brad, McKenna wanted you to know I'm volunteering at the Iron Brotherhood toy drive next Saturday. Hope that's okay. Gunnar typed back, more than okay, we can use the help. Thanks for stepping up. It's what Uncle David would have wanted. Finally feels right. The exchange was brief but carried weight that transcended the simple words. Morrison was finding his way back to something his uncle had understood, learning to honor David's memory by embracing the code rather than rejecting it. The healing was slow and imperfect, but it was happening, which was all anyone could ask. Sarah finished her edits, saved the document, closed her laptop with the satisfied finality of someone who'd completed work they were proud of. Done. Want to hear the whole thing? Always. She stood, picked up her notes, and launched into the presentation with the practiced delivery of someone who'd rehearsed enough times to have internalized the rhythm. Her voice carried confidence and passion in equal measure. And when she reached the part about watching her father refuse to move from his seat while security guards tried to intimidate him into leaving, her emotion was genuine and powerful. The conclusion tied everything together: military service, motorcycle brotherhood, the challenge coin's meaning, and what she'd learned about keeping promises regardless of cost. When she finished, the garage was silent except for the distant hum of traffic on the street outside. Gunnar stood crossed to where his daughter waited for feedback and pulled her into a hug that communicated more than any verbal assessment could manage. Your mom would be so proud of you. You think so? I know so. You're exactly who she hoped you'd become. Sarah hugged him back, and they stood together in the garage, surrounded by tools and motorcycles and the accumulated evidence of a life lived according to principles that mattered more than comfort. The challenge coin sat in Sarah's pocket, carried everywhere now, the same way Gunnar had carried it for 2 years after Elena's death. Outside, the December sun climbed toward its winter apex, and Phoenix prepared for another day where the temperature would hit 75 and people would wear shorts while the rest of the country shivered. The Iron Brotherhood would meet tomorrow for their weekly chapter gathering, and Gunnar would ride with his brothers through desert highways where the world made sense in ways civilization never quite managed. But right now, in this moment, he was just a father standing in a garage with his daughter who'd learned to stand tall and keep her word and carry forward the values that connected her to a mother who was gone, and a family line that stretched back through generations of McKennas, who'd understood that character was built in the moments when no one was watching and proven in the moments when everyone was. The challenge coin rested in Sarah's pocket, warm from her body heat, ready for whatever promises she'd make in the years ahead. And Marcus Gunnar McKenna knew with absolute certainty that when those promises came, when the cost mounted and the easy path beckoned, his daughter would choose to stand tall. Because that's what McKennas did. Because some things were worth defending regardless of price. Because a promise made was a debt owed, and debts got paid no matter how long it took or what it cost to make things square. Always faithful. To country. To family. To the word you gave when giving it meant something. That was the code. That was the legacy. That was what endured when everything else faded into memory and dust.